Subscribe now to receive daily miracles of Our Lady in your life. Margaret Whitman had already packed the adoption reversal papers in her briefcase when she found her daughter talking to the abandoned well for the third time that week. It was October 2019 in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the Whitman family had just moved into a historic adobe house on Canyon Road, one of those properties that real estate agents describe as full of character, which usually means full of problems. Thomas Whitman, an environmental engineer with a gentle smile and infinite patience, had fallen in love with the exposed wooden beams in the story that the house dated back to 1887. Margaret, a corporate litigation attorney accustomed to controlling every variable in her life, had agreed to the purchase for one reason only. The property was large enough that 8-year-old Lucia Navarro, legally Lucia Whitman for the past 3 years, might finally find some space to break the impenetrable silence that surrounded her like an invisible wall. But Margaret hadn't counted on the well. The stone structure sat in the back corner of the property, surrounded by wild chamisa bushes and half hidden beneath a rotting wooden cover. The home inspector had noted it as historical feature, sealed, no current utility, recommend decorative landscaping. Thomas had talked about turning it into a fountain. Margaret had planned to have it filled with concrete. Neither had imagined that their adopted daughter, the child who barely spoke 10 words a day, who flinched at physical affection, who looked through them rather than at them, would become obsessed with it. "Lucia," Margaret called out that Tuesday afternoon, her voice carrying the particular tension of a woman who has called the same name too many times without answer. "Lucia, where are you?" She found her daughter kneeling beside the well's stone rim, her small hands pressed against the weathered surface, her lips moving in whispered conversation with something Margaret couldn't see. "Who are you talking to?" Margaret asked, trying to keep the edge of frustration from her voice. Lucia turned slowly, her dark eyes, so different from Margaret's blue ones, a constant reminder that this child had not come from her body, holding that distant expression that made Margaret feel like a stranger in her own family. "The lady who lives in the water," Lucia said simply, in that soft accent that 3 years in an American home hadn't entirely erased. "She comes up when it's quiet. She wears blue and she understands Spanish." Margaret felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. "Sweetheart, there's no one in the well. It's been sealed for decades. Come inside and do your homework." "She knows you're sad," Lucia continued, as if Margaret hadn't spoken. "She says you carry a baby that never got to be born. She says that's why you can't love me the right way." The world tilted. Margaret Whitman, who had argued cases before the New Mexico Supreme Court without trembling, who had negotiated $1 million settlements without blinking, felt her knees weaken. The miscarriage had happened 7 years ago, before the fertility treatments, before the failed IVF cycles, before the adoption agency. She had told no one except Thomas, certainly not this child whom they'd brought home from a Tijuana orphanage when Lucia was 5 years old, traumatized and nearly mute. "What did you say?" Margaret whispered. But Lucia had already turned back to the well, her whispered Spanish conversation resuming as if Margaret had ceased to exist. That night, after Lucia had gone to bed without eating dinner, another frequent occurrence that Margaret had stopped fighting, Thomas found his wife sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine she wasn't drinking and documents she wasn't reading. "She's getting worse," Margaret said without preamble. "Today she told me things she couldn't possibly know, about the miscarriage, about feelings I've never said out loud." Thomas, who had learned during 16 years of marriage that his wife processed emotion through logic, waited. "I think we need to consider that we're not the right family for her," Margaret continued, her voice carefully controlled. "She's been with us 3 years and she's more distant now than when we brought her home. Maybe she needs parents who can connect with her in ways we can't. Maybe we made a mistake thinking we could just love her enough and everything would be fine." "Margaret, I've already contacted the agency. There are therapeutic foster homes that specialize in attachment disorders. She'd be better off. She's our daughter." "Is she?" Margaret's voice cracked finally, all the control shattering. "She won't let me touch her, Thomas. She won't call me Mom. When she looks at me, I see nothing. And now she's having hallucinations about women in wells who know my deepest secrets. We're failing her. I'm failing her." Thomas reached across the table and took his wife's hand, something Lucia had never allowed either of them to do with her. "What did she say exactly? About the miscarriage?" Margaret closed her eyes. "She said the lady in blue told her I carry a baby that never got to be born. And that's why I can't love Lucia the right way." She opened her eyes and they were wet. "How would she know that, Thomas? How would she know that every time I look at her, some terrible part of me wishes she were the biological daughter I couldn't have? You don't wish that, don't I?" Margaret pulled her hand away. "I look at her and I see everything I couldn't give birth to. Every time she pulls away from me, it confirms what I already believe, that I was never meant to be anyone's mother, that there's something broken in me that even an innocent child can sense." Before Thomas could respond, they heard it, a sound from upstairs that froze them both. Lucia was singing. In 3 years, they had never heard her sing, barely heard her speak. But now, floating down from her bedroom, came a melody in Spanish, pure and clear and heartbreakingly beautiful, a song neither of them recognized in a voice that seemed too mature for an 8-year-old child. They climbed the stairs together and stood in the doorway of Lucia's room, afraid to break whatever spell had been cast. The little girl sat cross-legged on her bed, her eyes closed, rocking slightly as she sang. The words were in Spanish, but even without understanding the language, Margaret felt their meaning in her bones. Something about water and light and a mother's embrace. When the song ended, Lucia opened her eyes and looked directly at Margaret for the first time in months, truly looked at her, with present and focused attention. "She wants to show you something," Lucia said. "Tomorrow, when the sun is highest, at the well. She says you have to come alone and you have to bring the picture you hide in the book by your bed." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. In the drawer of her nightstand, hidden inside a copy of Gift from the Sea that she'd owned since college, was a single ultrasound image, the only evidence of the pregnancy that had ended at 12 weeks. She had never told Lucia about the book, had never shown her the picture, had never even taken it out except on the anniversary of the due date that would never come. "How do you know about that picture?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. Lucia tilted her head, and for a moment, she looked like someone much older than 8. Someone who had seen suffering that adults shouldn't witness, let alone children. "The lady in blue showed me. She shows me lots of things. She showed me you when you were young and your mother died. She showed me you when the baby stopped moving inside you. She showed me you the day you came to the orphanage and saw me and thought I might fill the empty place, but then you got scared because I was too broken." Thomas made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob. Margaret stood frozen, every defense she had built around her heart crumbling like the rotting wood cover over the well. "I never thought you were too broken." "Yes, you did," Lucia said gently, without accusation. "And I thought you were too sad to be my mama. But the lady in blue says we're both wrong. She says tomorrow she'll show us how to be a real family. But you have to come to the well. You have to bring the picture, and you have to be brave enough to cry." That night, Margaret didn't sleep. She lay beside Thomas in the darkness of their bedroom, listening to him breathe, wondering how her carefully constructed life had come to this moment, taking instructions from an 8-year-old who claimed to speak with a woman in blue who lived in a sealed colonial well. The rational part of her mind cataloged explanations: childhood psychosis, dissociative disorder, elaborate manipulation born from institutional trauma. She had already scheduled an appointment with Dr. Helena Cortez, the best child psychiatrist in Santa Fe, for Thursday morning. But another part of her, the part that had been buried under law degrees and career achievements and fertility treatments and adoption paperwork, remembered being 17 and kneeling beside her mother's hospital bed, praying to a God she'd stopped believing in for a miracle that didn't come. That part of her remembered the small statue of the Virgin Mary her mother had kept on the nightstand, brought from her own mother's house in Chimayo, one of those old Santero carvings with paint flaking off and sad eyes that seemed to see everything. That part of her wondered if there were things between heaven and earth that her Harvard education hadn't prepared her to understand. As dawn broke over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the adobe walls of their bedroom gold and rose. Margaret made her decision. She would go to the well. She would bring the ultrasound picture, and she would see if an 8-year-old traumatized child and an impossible woman in blue could show a broken lawyer how to become the mother she'd failed to be. Behind the house, unknown to Margaret, the morning light touched the stone rim of the ancient well, illuminating lichen and weathered rock that had witnessed 3 centuries of prayers. Deep below, where the water table met bedrock and memory, something stirred. Not physically, but in that space where faith and hope and desperate love create openings for the impossible. A woman in blue, who had appeared to Juan Diego on another hill in another century, who had promised to be mother to all who sought her protection, waited patiently for noon, waited for a mother who couldn't love and a daughter who couldn't trust, waited to do what she had always done, take broken things and make them whole, take impossible situations and reveal the miracles hidden inside them, take families built on paper and legal documents and transform them into bonds that neither trauma nor fear could break. The well, which had been sealed for decades, seemed to hum with anticipation. Or perhaps that was just the October wind moving through the chamisa bushes, carrying with it the scent of rain and sage and something else. Something that smelled, inexplicably, like roses. Dr. Helena Cortez had spent 15 years treating traumatized children, and she prided herself on being able to distinguish between genuine psychological breaks and elaborate coping mechanisms born from unspeakable suffering. The little girl sitting across from her in the Tuesday morning appointment, moved up from Thursday at Margaret Whitman's urgent request, presented neither. Lucia Navarro Whitman sat perfectly still in the leather chair, her hands folded in her lap, her dark eyes watching Dr. Cortez with an unnerving directness that most 8-year-olds couldn't maintain. She wasn't fidgeting, wasn't anxious, wasn't displaying any of the typical signs of a child in crisis. She looked, Dr. Cortez thought with some discomfort, like someone waiting patiently for the doctor to understand something obvious. "Lucia, your mother tells me you've been seeing someone at the old well in your backyard," Dr. Cortez began, using her gentlest therapeutic voice. "Can you tell me about this person?" "She's not a person," Lucia corrected politely. "She's the Mother of God. She told me her name is Maria de Guadalupe, but she says I can call her Mama Santissima if it feels more comfortable." Dr. Cortez made a note. Religious delusions in adopted children from Catholic backgrounds weren't uncommon, especially when combined with institutional trauma. "And what does Maria look like?" "Like the tilma," Lucia said simply. "Like the image in the basilica in Mexico City that my first mother took me to see before she died. Blue mantle with stars, roses on her dress, hands pressed together like she's praying, but also like she's holding all the sadness in the world and keeping it safe." Margaret Whitman, sitting in the corner of the office, made a small sound. "Doctor." Cortez glanced at her and saw tears streaming silently down the lawyer's face. "Mrs. Whitman, did you know Lucia's biological mother took her to the Basilica of Guadalupe?" Margaret shook her head. "The orphanage records said her mother died when she was 4. We were never told any details about her life before. Lucia has never spoken about her." Dr. Cortez turned back to the child. "Lucia, you've never told your adoptive parents about your first mother?" For the first time, emotion flickered across Lucia's composed face, something deep and painful. It hurt too much to remember, and they didn't ask the right way. They asked with words, but the lady in blue asks with her heart, so I can answer with my heart instead of my mouth. "I see." Dr. Cortez made another note, this time with less clinical certainty. "And what does this lady tell you?" "She tells me about Margaret," Lucia said, using her adoptive mother's first name without apparent awareness of the informality. "She shows me things Margaret is too afraid to say, like the baby that died inside her. Like the day Margaret's mother died and she prayed so hard her throat hurt but God seemed far away. Like the moment in the orphanage when Margaret saw me and wanted to love me but couldn't figure out how, because I reminded her of everything missing." Margaret stood up abruptly, her professional composure completely shattered. "How do you know these things? How could you possibly— The lady in blue knows everything," Lucia said calmly. She knew you were coming to the well yesterday at noon. She was sad when you didn't come. She says you brought the picture from your drawer, but you sat in the kitchen for an hour looking at it, and then you put it back because you were too frightened. Dr. Cortez felt the room's temperature seemed to drop. Mrs. Whitman, is this accurate? Margaret sank back into her chair, nodding mutely. Yesterday at 11:30, she had taken the ultrasound image from its hiding place, had stood at the kitchen window looking out at the well, and had ultimately retreated, telling herself she was being manipulated by a disturbed child, that she was allowing grief and guilt to override her rational judgment. She hadn't told anyone, not even Thomas. There are several possible explanations, Dr. Cortez said, though her voice carried less conviction than before. Lucia may have observed your routines, noticed patterns of behavior that indicated emotional distress. Children from traumatic backgrounds often develop hypervigilance that borders on the uncanny. She knew about my mother's statue, Margaret interrupted. The one from Chimayo. I haven't thought about that statue in 20 years. It was sold at an estate sale after my mother died, but yesterday Lucia described it perfectly, down to the chip on the Virgin's left hand and the way the blue paint had faded to almost white. Lucia nodded. The lady in blue says your mother prayed to that statue every day of her life. She says your mother is with her now, and your mother wants you to know that the prayer she said the night before she died, the one you never heard, was that someday you would find a daughter who needed you as much as you needed her. The sound that came from Margaret Whitman was something Dr. Cortez had heard before in her practice, but rarely. The sound of a soul breaking open. The lawyer doubled over in her chair, sobbing with an abandon that suggested years of suppressed grief finally finding release. Dr. Cortez stood, uncertain whether to comfort her client or maintain professional boundaries, when Lucia did something that stopped everyone in the room. The little girl climbed down from her chair, walked to Margaret, and for the first time since her adoption 3 years earlier, initiated physical contact. She placed her small hand on Margaret's shoulder, a touch so gentle it was barely perceptible, and said in Spanish, "Ya no llores, mamá. Ella dice que todo estará bien. Don't cry anymore, mama. She says everything will be okay." Margaret looked up at the child she had been planning to send away, and something shifted in her face. Some wall that had been built stone by stone through years of loss and disappointment began to crack. "I'm so sorry," Margaret whispered. "I'm so sorry I couldn't love you right. I'm so sorry I made you feel like you weren't enough." "You were scared," Lucia said simply. "The lady in blue says being scared is okay. She says even she was scared when the angel came. But she said yes anyway. That's the brave part. Saying yes, even when you're scared." Dr. Cortez, watching this exchange, felt her clinical training colliding with something she couldn't quite categorize. She cleared her throat. "Mrs. Whitman, I'd like to recommend a neurological evaluation for Lucia. I want to rule out any temporal lobe abnormalities that might explain these experiences. We should also consider an MRI." "She's not sick," Margaret said, still holding Lucia's gaze. "Is she?" "I would strongly advise against dismissing medical evaluation in favor of supernatural explanations," Dr. Cortez said firmly. "Children with complex trauma can develop elaborate fantasy structures as protective mechanisms. The specificity of Lucia's knowledge could be explained by observational data she's processed unconsciously. We need to be responsible here." Margaret finally broke eye contact with Lucia and turned to the psychiatrist. "What if it's not a fantasy? What if there really is something at that well? Then we need to rule out environmental factors. Old wells can accumulate gases, carbon monoxide, methane, that cause hallucinations. The property should be tested. I can recommend an environmental specialist." "Test the property," Margaret interrupted. "Do the MRI. Schedule every evaluation you think necessary, but I'm going to that well, today, at noon, and I'm bringing the picture." Dr. Cortez spent the next 20 minutes trying to dissuade her client from what she termed enabling a delusional episode. But Margaret Whitman, who had spent her career building airtight arguments and dismantling opposing positions, was immovable. They left the office at 11:15. Dr. Cortez watched from her window as Margaret buckled Lucia into the car seat, saw the way the little girl smiled, actually smiled, for the first time since Dr. Cortez had met her. And Dr. Cortez, despite her training and her skepticism and her firm belief in neurological explanations for mystical experiences, felt something she rarely experienced: doubt. By 11:45, Margaret and Lucia stood in their backyard, the October sun climbing toward its zenith, the well waiting like a stone witness to whatever would happen next. Margaret held the ultrasound image in her hand, that grainy black and white picture of a 12-week fetus who would have been 7 years old now, who would have had Margaret's eyes or Thomas's smile, who existed now only as memory and grief and the persistent question, why wasn't I enough to make life stay? She's already here, Lucia whispered. Do you see her? Margaret looked at the well, at the weathered stones and the broken wooden cover and the wild chamisa bushes, and saw nothing but noon shadows and October light. I don't see anything, sweetheart. Close your lawyer eyes, Lucia said. Open your mama eyes. Margaret didn't know what that meant, but she closed her eyes anyway, feeling foolish and desperate and strangely hopeful all at once. The October breeze touched her face, carrying that impossible scent of roses that had no source, and she heard, or felt, or imagined, something like a voice without sound. Hija mia, open your heart. And Margaret Whitman, who had built her life on evidence and argument and rational thought, who had stopped praying when her mother died and God seemed absent, who had locked away her grief in a drawer beside a copy of Anne Morrow Lindbergh and an ultrasound of a baby who never breathed. Margaret Whitman opened her eyes and saw, not with physical sight exactly, but with something deeper and truer. A woman stood beside the well, or perhaps she stood within it, rising from the water that shouldn't exist in a sealed shaft. Her mantle was the blue of high desert sky, covered with stars that seemed to hold their own light. Her dress bore roses that moved as if in a breeze that touched nothing else. Her face was mestiza, indigenous and Spanish, ancient and young, human and something far more, and her eyes held such love that Margaret felt it like a physical force, like being pulled from drowning water into air. I see you, Margaret breathed, not sure if she was speaking aloud or only in her heart. Holy Mary, I see you. The woman in blue smiled, and the world seemed to tilt toward joy. She extended her hands toward Margaret, not commanding, but inviting, and Margaret understood without words what was being asked. She looked down at the ultrasound image, that artifact of loss she had clutched like a talisman for 7 years, and felt something release in her chest. Not the grief. The grief would always be part of her, but the belief that the grief meant she was unworthy. The belief that loss disqualified her from love. I wanted this baby so much, Margaret said, her voice breaking. I wanted to be a mother more than I wanted anything in my life. And when I lost her, or him, we never knew. I thought it meant I wasn't supposed to be a mother at all, that there was something wrong with me that even God could see. The woman in blue didn't speak with voice, but Margaret heard her response in that place beyond hearing. Nothing is wrong with you, Hija. You were being prepared for a different child, for this child, for the daughter who needed a mother who understands loss, who could teach her that love doesn't require perfection, only presence. Margaret turned to Lucia, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time, not as a replacement for the baby she'd lost, not as a second choice or a consolation prize, but as herself. A small girl who had lost her first mother and feared losing her second. A child who had been warehoused in an institution and learned to protect herself with silence. A daughter who needed exactly the mother Margaret was, wounded and imperfect and real. I'm sorry I couldn't see you before, Margaret whispered, kneeling so she was eye level with Lucia. I'm sorry I was so busy grieving what I'd lost that I couldn't receive what I'd been given. You're not a replacement, Lucia. You're not second best. You're exactly the daughter I was meant to have, and I've been too broken to understand that until now. Lucia's eyes filled with tears, the first Margaret had ever seen her cry. Even though I'm not from your body? Especially because you're not from my body, Margaret said fiercely. Because you chose us. Because we chose you. Because love isn't about biology. It's about showing up and staying and learning how to be family even when it's hard and scary and nothing like what we imagined. And then Margaret did what she should have done 3 years ago but had been too frightened and too defended to do. She opened her arms and waited, not forcing, just offering. Lucia fell into her embrace like someone who had been waiting forever to come home. They knelt there beside the well, holding each other and crying, while the woman in blue watched with a smile that suggested she had orchestrated this moment across time and tragedy, and all the complicated ways humans wound each other while trying to love. When they finally pulled apart, Margaret looked back toward the well and the woman was gone, if she had ever been there in any physical sense. But the rose scent lingered, and something had fundamentally changed in the air, in the light, in the very soil of the property. "She's not gone," Lucia said, reading her new mother's expression. "She's never gone. She just doesn't always need to be seen. She says we have to do the rest ourselves. She says she's given us the beginning, but we have to build the middle and the end." Margaret laughed, a sound that surprised her with its lightness. "Did she give you any instructions for the middle part?" "She says you have to stop trying to be perfect. She says Thomas is sad because he thinks you don't trust him to be a good father. She says you all need to tell each other the true things even when they're scary, and she says—" Lucia paused, tilting her head as if listening to something only she could hear. "She says you should have another baby." Margaret froze. "What?" "She says your body isn't broken. She says the doctors were wrong. She says if you stop being afraid and start being hopeful, within a year you'll hold a son, and he and I will be best friends, and he'll teach you how to laugh again." It was too much, too specific, too impossible. Margaret started to protest, to explain about the endometriosis and the poor egg quality and the 5 failed IVF cycles, and the reality that at 42 years old with her medical history. But Lucia was looking at her with such certainty, such unshakable faith, that the protests died in her throat. "The lady in blue doesn't lie," Lucia said simply. "She told Juan Diego there would be roses on the hill in winter, and there were. She told me you would see her today, and you did. She says she tells you now there will be a baby, and there will be." Margaret looked down at the ultrasound image in her hand, that memorial to impossibility, and made a decision that defied every rational bone in her lawyer's body. She released it, let it flutter from her fingers into the well, watching it spiral down toward water that might or might not exist, toward darkness that might hold miracles or might hold nothing but stone and sealed earth. "Okay," Margaret whispered. "Okay, I believe." And somewhere in that space between heaven and earth, between doubt and faith, between the family she'd tried to build on fear and the family she was learning to build on love, a woman in blue smiled. The real work, after all, was just beginning. Thomas Whitman returned home from a 3-day conference in Albuquerque to find his house transformed in ways that had nothing to do with furniture or paint. His wife, the woman who had been moving through their marriage like a ghost for the past several years, present but not really there, met him at the door with an embrace that felt different, not desperate or dutiful, but genuine. And behind her stood Lucia, not hiding in her room or maintaining her usual careful distance, but actually smiling at him. "What happened?" Thomas asked, though the question felt inadequate for the magnitude of the change he sensed. "Everything," Margaret said simply. "Come sit down. We have a lot to tell you." Over the next 2 hours, while October afternoon faded into evening, Margaret and Lucia told him about the well, the woman in blue, the impossible knowledge, and the moment beside the old stones when a mother and daughter had finally found each other. Thomas listened with the careful attention of an engineer accustomed to data and evidence, and when they finished, he asked the question that his scientific training demanded. "So, what do we actually know for certain?" Margaret appreciated that he hadn't dismissed it outright, hadn't ridiculed or patronized. "We know that Lucia has information she shouldn't have access to. We know that I saw something, or experienced something, that I can't explain rationally. And we know that whatever happened, it broke through walls that years of therapy and effort couldn't touch. Dr. Cortez called me this afternoon, Thomas said carefully. She's concerned. She wants to bring in a team, neurologists, environmental specialists, even a physicist from Los Alamos who studies electromagnetic fields and their effects on perception. She's worried we're enabling a shared delusion. Let them come, Margaret said with a confidence that surprised even herself. Test everything. I want to know if there's a rational explanation. But Thomas, she reached for his hand. Even if they find gas leaks or brain abnormalities or electromagnetic anomalies, it won't change what happened between Lucia and me. It won't undo the healing. Thomas looked at his daughter, their daughter, who was curled up beside Margaret on the couch in a physical closeness that would have been unthinkable a week ago. Lucia, what do you think? Do you want doctors examining you? Lucia considered the question with that unsettling maturity she sometimes displayed. The lady in blue says truth isn't afraid of questions. She says let them look. They'll find what they're supposed to find. Which is what? Thomas asked. That she was really here. That she's been here for a very long time. That this place was holy before our house was built, before America was America, before anyone thought wells were just for water. 3 days later, the testing began. Dr. Cortez arrived with a team that included Dr. Raymond Chen, a neurologist from the University of New Mexico, Patricia Valdez, an environmental engineer who specialized in historic properties, and somewhat surprisingly, Father Miguel Sandoval from the Cathedral Basilica of St. Francis of Assisi, who had been quietly included at the suggestion of the Archbishop after Dr. Cortez mentioned certain details of the case. Father Sandoval was 72 years old, with silver hair and eyes that had seen enough of life to be skeptical of easy miracles and open to genuine mystery. He had spent 30 years as a priest in New Mexico and had investigated dozens of alleged Marian apparitions, Eucharistic miracles, and supernatural healings, most of which had turned out to be fraud, delusion, or misunderstood natural phenomena. But something about the Whitman case intrigued him. The medical testing came first. Lucia underwent an MRI that showed a completely healthy brain. No tumors, no lesions, no abnormalities in the temporal lobes where religious experiences were sometimes localized. Her blood work was normal. Her psychiatric evaluation, conducted by an outside specialist brought in by Dr. Chen, showed a child who had experienced early trauma but was cognitively intact and, remarkably, showing signs of recent significant emotional improvement. There's nothing wrong with her medically, Dr. Chen told the assembled team in the Whitman's living room that Friday evening. No neurological basis for hallucinations or delusions. In fact, she's one of the healthiest 8-year-olds I've examined, Patricia Valdez presented next. The well structure dates to approximately 1680, making it one of the oldest European constructions in Santa Fe. Property records show it was part of a Spanish colonial rancho that was built on land that had been inhabited by Tewa people. Core samples from the well shaft show no evidence of toxic gases, mold, or any environmental contaminants that might cause altered states of consciousness. She paused, pulling out another document. However, I did find something unusual. At the bottom of the well, approximately 40 feet down, there's a sealed chamber that appears to be man-made. Ground-penetrating radar suggests it's about 8 feet in diameter. The original well was dug down to reach it, not the other way around. Thomas leaned forward. You're saying someone built a chamber and then dug a well shaft to access it? That's what the data suggests, and there's something else. Patricia pulled out a photograph showing the radar imaging. There are objects inside the chamber. I can't tell what they are without excavation, but they're definitely there, and they've been there for centuries. Father Sandoval spoke for the first time. In the Spanish colonial period, it wasn't uncommon for indigenous people to hide sacred objects from the missionaries, or for converted indigenous Catholics to create hidden shrines that blended both traditions. If this property was built on a Tewa holy site, the chamber might contain artifacts that were important enough to preserve in secret. Dr. Cortez, who had been listening with increasing frustration, interrupted. This is all very interesting from a historical perspective, but It doesn't explain how an 8-year-old child knows intimate details about her adoptive mother's life. Unless, she turned to Margaret. Mrs. Whitman, is it possible that in moments of stress over the past 3 years, you spoke aloud about your miscarriage or your mother's death, that Lucia overheard conversations she wasn't supposed to hear? Margaret shook her head. I haven't spoken about those things to anyone except Thomas, and never when Lucia was present. I've barely allowed myself to think about them. Childhood trauma can create something called hypervigilancing, Dr. Cortez pressed. Children from institutional backgrounds learn to read adult emotions with uncanny accuracy. They pick up micro-expressions, vocal tones, behavioral patterns that most people miss. Lucia could have constructed a narrative based on observational data. She described my mother's statue, Margaret said quietly. A specific statue that was sold 20 years ago at an estate sale I didn't attend because I was too angry at God to care about my mother's religious objects. She described the chip on the Virgin's hand and the faded blue paint. How would observational data explain that? Silence filled the room. Father Sandoval cleared his throat. With your permission, I'd like to speak with Lucia privately. Just a conversation. Nothing invasive, nothing leading. I've been doing this kind of evaluation for 3 decades, and I have some experience distinguishing between genuine mystical experiences and other phenomena. Margaret looked at Thomas, who nodded. Lucia, would you be comfortable talking with Father Sandoval? The little girl, who had been sitting quietly on the stairs listening to everything, stood up. Yes. The lady in blue said he would come. She says he's one of the ones who still believes even though he's seen so many lies. Father Sandoval's eyebrows rose, but he simply gestured toward the kitchen. Shall we? They sat at the kitchen table, the priest and the child, with mugs of hot chocolate that Thomas had made. Through the window they could see the well in the backyard, its stones catching the last of the October twilight. Lucia, I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer honestly, even if you think the answer might get you in trouble. Can you do that? Yes, Father. When you see this woman in blue, is it with your eyes or with your mind? Lucia considered this carefully. Both, and neither. It's like, you know how you can see something in a dream so clearly that it feels more real than being awake? It's like that, but I'm not sleeping. Does she speak in words you hear with your ears? Sometimes. Mostly she speaks in feelings and pictures that I understand like words. It's hard to explain. I understand. Father Sandoval had heard similar descriptions before from genuine mystics. Does she ever ask you to do anything that would hurt yourself or others? No. She only asks me to love people and tell them true things and not be afraid. The true things you told your mother about the miscarriage and the statue, how did you learn them? The lady showed me, like a movie, but more real. She showed me Margaret when she was my age and her mama was alive and they went to church together. She showed me Margaret when she was 17 and her mama died, and she stopped believing God loved her. She showed me Margaret trying to have babies and not being able to, and the sadness getting so big it filled up all the space where love should be. Father Sandoval felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. Lucia, has the woman in blue ever told you her name? Maria de Guadalupe, but also other names. She says she's been called many names by many people. Estrella de la Mañana, Reina del Cielo, Consoladora de los Afligidos. She says names don't matter as much as love. She says she's the mother of everyone who needs a mother, especially people whose mothers died or left or couldn't love them right. The priest was quiet for a long moment. What does she want from you, Lucia? Why do you think she appears to you? Because I needed her, Lucia said simply, and because Margaret needed her, and because this house is built on a place where she's been loved for a very long time, and she wants people to remember. She looked directly at Father Sandoval with those unsettlingly adult eyes. She wants you to open the chamber. She says what's inside will help you believe again. Believe what? That she's real. That miracles aren't just stories. That even when everything seems dark and broken, she's still there, still fighting for us, still loving us so much it breaks through stone and time and all the walls people build around their hearts. Father Sandoval found himself blinking back tears, which surprised him. He had thought himself long past being moved by children's religious visions. What happened to your faith, Lucia? The faith you had before your first mother died? For the first time, real pain crossed the child's face. It died with her. I thought if I prayed hard enough, God would let her stay. But she died anyway, and I was alone, and God seemed like a lie. And now? Now I know God doesn't always stop bad things from happening, but He sends His mother to sit with us while we hurt, to remind us we're not alone, to help us find new families when our first families are gone. She reached across the table and took the priest's weathered hand. She says to tell you that your sister forgives you. She says the accident wasn't your fault. She says you've carried that guilt for 40 years and it's time to put it down. Father Sandoval jerked his hand back as if burned. What did you say? Your sister Rosa. The car accident when you were 19 and she was 16. You were driving. The drunk driver hit you from the side. She died and you lived, and you've spent your whole life trying to earn forgiveness for being the one who survived. The priest stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His face had gone pale. I've never told anyone the details of... How do you know that name? The lady in blue knows everything, Lucia said gently. She knows all the sad stories, all the places people hurt. She shows me so I can help them know they're loved. Father Sandoval gripped the edge of the table, his hands shaking. The accident that had killed his younger sister had been the defining trauma of his life, the reason he'd entered the priesthood, the source of his skepticism about easy grace and cheap miracles. He had told his confessors over the years, but never the full story. Never his sister's name. Never the specific details that this 8-year-old child had just recited with perfect accuracy. Father, Lucia's voice was soft. She says you're supposed to help us. She says there are people who are going to try to stop us from opening the chamber, people who are afraid of what we'll find. She says you're the one who knows how to protect sacred things. The priest lowered himself back into his chair slowly. Who would try to stop you? I don't know yet, but she says darkness always fights back when light starts breaking through. She says the next few days are going to be hard. She says Margaret and Thomas are going to doubt again. She says you're going to have to be strong for all of us. Before Father Sandoval could respond, they heard raised voices from the living room. Dr. Cortez was standing now, her professional calm cracking. I am not going to stand by while you enable a child's delusional system by excavating a well based on her hallucinations. This has gone far enough. I'm recommending immediate psychiatric intervention and, if necessary, temporary removal from the home until we can ensure... You're recommending removing my daughter from my home. Margaret's voice was dangerously quiet. Based on what grounds? Based on the fact that you are all engaging in a shared psychotic episode. This entire family needs psychiatric evaluation, and Lucia needs intensive treatment before this fantasy becomes so entrenched that... Dr. Cortez. Father Sandoval's voice cut through the argument like a blade. He and Lucia had returned to the living room. I need to speak with you privately. The psychiatrist turned to him, her face flushed with frustration. Father, with all respect, this is a medical issue, not a spiritual one. Humor me. 5 minutes. They stepped out onto the front porch. The October night was cold and clear, the stars over Santa Fe bright enough to cast shadows. You're making a mistake, Father Sandoval said without preamble. Excuse me. I've spent 30 years investigating alleged miracles. I've exposed frauds and gently redirected the delusional. I know the difference between psychiatric crisis and genuine mystical experience. And that child in there. He paused, collecting himself. That child just told me things about my life that no one knows. Not my bishop, not my spiritual director. Things I've carried in secret for 40 years. Dr. Cortez's expression softened slightly. Father, I understand that traumatized children can be remarkably perceptive. She knew my sister's name. She knew details of the accident that killed her. She described the specific intersection where it happened and the color of the car that hit us. Unless you're suggesting this 8-year-old somehow researched 40-year-old police reports from a traffic accident in Española and memorized them for the purpose of manipulating a priest she'd never met. I think we need to consider the possibility that something genuinely extraordinary is occurring here. Dr. Cortez was quiet for a long moment. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we excavate the chamber. I'm suggesting we document everything carefully and scientifically, but we remain open to the possibility that there are more things in heaven and earth than our current models account for. I'm suggesting that removing Lucia from this home right now would be the worst thing we could do, not just for her, but for all of us. And if we excavate and find nothing, if this turns out to be an elaborate shared fantasy, then we deal with that when it happens. But if we don't look, if we shut this down out of fear or scientific prejudice, we might miss something that could change not just this family, but our understanding of what's possible in this strange and holy world. Doctor? Cortez looked back through the window at the Whitman family, at Margaret and Thomas standing close together, at Lucia sitting on the couch looking small and vulnerable and somehow also ancient. You really believe this could be real? I believe Rosa forgave me 40 years ago, but I've been too wrapped in guilt to receive it. I believe a child I just met somehow knew that and offered me healing I didn't know I needed. And I believe that if there's even a chance that the Mother of God is trying to tell us something through an old well in Santa Fe, we have an obligation to listen. The psychiatrist took a deep breath of cold night air. Okay, we excavate, but carefully, with full documentation. And if at any point Lucia shows signs of genuine psychological decompensation, we intervene immediately. Agreed. They returned inside to find the family waiting in tense silence. We're going to open the chamber, Dr. Cortez announced, but under controlled conditions with full scientific documentation. Margaret's shoulders dropped with relief. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. We don't know what we're going to find. But Lucia smiled. A small, knowing smile that suggested she knew exactly what they would find, and that it would change everything. Outside, the well waited in darkness, holding secrets that had been sealed for more than 3 centuries. And somewhere in the space between earth and heaven, a woman in blue who had appeared to an indigenous peasant named Juan Diego in 1531, who had promised to be mother to all who sought her protection, who had watched empires rise and fall while her love remained constant. That woman prepared for the next act of her ancient drama, because the healing of a mother and daughter was only the beginning. The real miracle was still buried, waiting to be uncovered. The excavation began at dawn on a Saturday morning in late October, under skies so clear and blue they seemed artificial. Patricia Valdez had assembled a team of archaeologists from the Museum of New Mexico, along with structural engineers to ensure the well shaft wouldn't collapse during the dig. Father Sandoval had obtained permission from the Archbishop to be present for whatever they might find. Dr. Cortez attended with 2 colleagues, determined to document everything with clinical precision, and the Whitman family stood together in their backyard, watching as strangers prepared to excavate the mystery that had transformed their lives. She says today everything changes, Lucia whispered to Margaret, holding her adoptive mother's hand with a naturalness that still felt miraculous after years of distance. She says what's buried down there has been waiting for the right time, for the right people, for us. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand but said nothing. Despite everything she'd experienced, despite the healing that had occurred between them, a part of her remained terrified that this would all collapse into embarrassment, that they'd excavate and find nothing but rocks and dirt, and everyone would realize she'd been swept up in mass delusion. Thomas stood on her other side, his engineer's mind cycling through possibilities. Even if there's nothing supernatural down there, the historical significance of a sealed 17th century chamber would be remarkable. Always hedging your bets, Margaret said, but there was affection in her voice. That's why you married me. Someone in this family needs to stay grounded. By mid-morning, the team had removed the rotting wooden cover and begun the careful work of descending into the well shaft with climbing equipment and lights. Patricia Valdez went down first, followed by Dr. James Whitehorse, an archaeologist from Ocayo Wingue Pueblo, who specialized in Spanish colonial and indigenous sites. Those waiting above could hear their voices echoing up from the depths, muffled and distorted by distance and stone. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Margaret was beginning to fear something had gone wrong when Patricia's voice crackled over the radio. "We've reached the sealed entrance to the chamber. The seal appears to be original, adobe and stone undisturbed for centuries. We're going to document everything before breaking through. Stand by." Another 40 minutes of waiting. Margaret watched Lucia, who stood perfectly calm, occasionally tilting her head as if listening to something no one else could hear. "Is she still there?" Margaret asked quietly. "The lady in blue?" "She's always there," Lucia said. "But right now she's very close, she's excited. Like when you give someone a present and you can't wait for them to open it." Finally, Patricia's voice returned, and this time it carried an unmistakable tremor of excitement. "We're through the seal. The chamber is intact. And there's..." A pause, the sound of breath catching. "There's something extraordinary down here. We need Father Sandoval to descend immediately." The priest, despite his 72 years, moved with surprising agility. He was harnessed and lowered into the well shaft while the crowd above waited in tense silence. 15 minutes later, his voice came over the radio, and those who knew him well had never heard him sound like this, something between awe and tears. "Bring down evidence bags, archival storage materials, and camera equipment, and someone needs to contact the Archbishop directly. Tell him..." Another pause, longer this time. "Tell him Our Lady of Guadalupe has been in Santa Fe much longer than we knew." The next hour was controlled chaos as equipment was lowered, photographs were taken, and finally, carefully wrapped objects began to emerge from the well shaft. The first was a terracotta statue, perhaps 18 inches tall, wrapped in what had once been woven cloth that had mostly disintegrated over the centuries. When Father Sandoval unwrapped it on a tarp in the backyard, surrounded by witnesses and cameras, everyone present drew breath simultaneously. It was a figure of the Virgin Mary, indigenous in features, wearing a blue mantle covered with stars, hands pressed together in prayer, standing on a crescent moon. The style was crude but powerful, clearly made by hand, and despite 3 centuries underground, it remained largely intact. "That's her," Lucia said simply, pointing. "That's exactly what she looks like. That's my lady from the well." Dr. Whitehorse knelt beside the statue, his hands hovering over it without touching. "This is Pueblo pottery technique, but the iconography is Guadalupan, early Spanish colonial period. I'd estimate 1680 or shortly before. This would have been created during a time when Pueblo peoples were being forced to convert, but were also incorporating Catholicism into their own spiritual traditions." "There's more," Patricia said, as additional wrapped bundles were brought up. "Much more." Over the next hour, they extracted a small wooden cross with Spanish inscriptions, beads made from local turquoise that might have been a rosary, pieces of painted buffalo hide showing religious images, and most remarkably, a leather-bound journal that had been sealed in a clay pot, preserving it against moisture. Father Sandoval opened the journal with trembling hands, revealing pages of Spanish text in faded brown ink. He read aloud, translating as he went. "June 10th, 1680. I write this in secret, knowing we may not survive what is coming. The Pueblo peoples prepare to rise against us, and I cannot blame them for the cruelties they have suffered. But there is one among them, a woman named Singing Water, who has seen visions of the Mother of God who appeared at Tepeyac. She says the Virgin has shown her that this place, this spring we foolishly built our well upon, is holy ground where prayers ascend directly to heaven. Singing Water has made an image of the Virgin in the Pueblo way, and we have hidden it below the spring with other sacred objects. She says that someday, when enough suffering has passed and enough love has been rebuilt, the Mother of God will reveal herself again from this place. She says the Virgin will use a child, an orphan who knows loss, to heal a mother whose heart is closed. She says this will be the sign that it is time for the chamber to be opened. I do not know if I will live to see tomorrow. The rebellion begins tonight, and my fellow priest and I will likely die for the sins of our brethren. But I believe Singing Water's visions. I have seen too much that cannot be explained. And so I seal this record with prayer that someday, centuries hence, someone will find this and know that Our Lady of Guadalupe blessed this ground long before America existed, that she has always loved all peoples, and that she waits patiently through time to heal those who cry out to her. Padre Cristobal de Rivera, of the Order of St. Francis. Silence fell over the assembled group. Even Dr. Cortez, whose skepticism had been unshakable, stood frozen. Dr. Whitehorse spoke first. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 killed hundreds of Spanish colonists and priests. It was one of the most successful indigenous uprisings in North American history. If this was written the day before the revolt began, this priest almost certainly died the next day. He looked at the journal with reverence. This is an extraordinary historical document. And this prophecy that specifically describes Lucia and Margaret, Father Sandoval finished, a child orphan who knows loss, used to heal a mother whose heart is closed, written 345 years ago. Margaret felt the world tilting. That's not possible. It's documented, Patricia said, pointing to the journal. We can carbon date the paper and ink, but the leather binding alone shows this is genuinely 17th century. And the statue, Dr. Whitehorse can confirm the pottery is consistent with 1680 Pueblo techniques. This isn't a hoax. This has been sealed down there for over 3 centuries. Dr. Cortez finally found her voice. Even if we accept the dating, and I want extensive laboratory verification, this could be coincidence. The prophecy is vague enough to apply to many situations. It describes this well, Father Sandoval interrupted gently. On this property, with these specific circumstances. Dr. Cortez, I understand your resistance. I've shared it my entire career. But at some point when the evidence accumulates past a certain threshold, maintaining skepticism becomes its own kind of faith. Faith that there must be a rational explanation, even when none presents itself. Thomas, ever the engineer, asked the practical question, what happens now? Father Sandoval carefully rewrapped the statue. These artifacts need to be properly preserved and studied. The journal needs translation and authentication. The Archbishop will need to be informed, and likely Rome as well. If this is what it appears to be, evidence of a centuries-old Marian apparition prophecy coming to fulfillment, it's going to attract international attention. No. Lucia's voice was quiet but firm. Everyone turned to look at her. The lady says the statue stays here. She says it was hidden here because this ground is holy. She says if you take it away, you break something that can't be fixed. Lucia, these are priceless historical artifacts, Dr. Whitehorse said kindly. They belong in a museum where they can be protected and studied. They belong where the lady put them, Lucia insisted. You can study them here. You can bring all the scientists and priests you want. But the statue stays. She was very clear about that. Father Sandoval looked at Margaret and Thomas. It's your property. Legally, the decision is yours. Margaret knelt beside her daughter. Lucia, we need to think carefully about this. These objects could teach us so much about history. They'll teach you more about love, Lucia said. That's what the lady says. She says the miracles aren't finished. She says what happened between you and me was just the first one. She says... She paused, that listening expression crossing her face again. She says Margaret is pregnant. The words fell into the gathering like stones into still water. Margaret's hand went instinctively to her stomach. That's not possible. The doctors said... The lady in blue doesn't care what doctors said. She says you're carrying a son. She says his name should be Cristobal, after the priest who believed singing water. She says he'll be born healthy in July, and he'll grow up to be a doctor who heals children, and his whole life will be a miracle that started in this well. Dr. Cortez pulled out her phone. Mrs. Whitman, with your permission, I'd like to schedule a pregnancy test immediately. If Lucia is correct, that would be medically impossible, Margaret finished. I have stage 4 endometriosis, multiple fibroids, Asherman syndrome from the D&C after the miscarriage. 3 fertility specialists agreed that pregnancy without IVF was impossible, and we failed 5 IVF cycles. I can't be pregnant. Then you won't mind taking a test, Dr. Cortez said, her scientific mind already racing with implications. 2 hours later, in the emergency room at Christus St. Vincent, a stunned obstetrician named Dr. Sarah Chen looked at Margaret Whitman's blood test results and ultrasound images with the expression of someone whose understanding of medicine had just been fundamentally challenged. "You're approximately 7 weeks pregnant," Dr. Chen said slowly. "The embryo is measuring perfectly for gestational age. Heartbeat is strong at 152 beats per minute, and Mrs. Whitman..." She paused, pulling up the ultrasound image again. "Your uterus shows no signs of endometriosis. The fibroids that were documented in your medical records from 6 months ago are gone. The Asherman's adhesions are gone. Your uterine lining is perfect. It's as if I'd never had any of those conditions," Margaret whispered. "I've never seen anything like this. Endometriosis doesn't just disappear. Fibroids don't spontaneously resolve. And Asherman syndrome definitely doesn't heal itself. Yet here you are, not only pregnant, but pregnant in a uterus that appears completely healthy." Thomas, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally spoke. "When would conception have occurred?" Dr. Chen checked her calculations. "Based on the measurements, approximately 7 weeks ago, so early September." Margaret and Thomas looked at each other, both doing the same math. 7 weeks ago was mid-September, the weekend before they'd moved into the house on Canyon Road. Before Lucia had started talking to the well. Before any of this had begun. Or had it? "The lady knew before we did," Lucia said softly from where she sat in the corner of the exam room. "She always knows. She was preparing the way before we even knew we needed it." Dr. Chen looked between the family members, clearly sensing she was missing something crucial. "Is there something else I should know about this pregnancy?" Father Sandoval, who had accompanied them to the hospital, spoke up. "Doctor, do you believe in miracles?" "I believe in medicine and science." "Then you're going to have a very interesting 7 months, the priest said with a slight smile. "Because what you're witnessing is medically impossible, yet undeniably real, which means you're going to have to expand your definition of what's possible." Over the next week, as news of the discoveries spread, the Whitman house became a pilgrimage site. The Archbishop came personally to examine the artifacts and interview Lucia. He spent 3 hours in conversation with the 8-year-old, emerging shaken and declaring that while the church would need to conduct formal investigation, he personally believed something extraordinary was occurring. Scientists from the University of New Mexico confirmed that the pottery dated to the late 17th century, that the journal was authentic, and that there was no rational explanation for how a 1680 prophecy could have described a 2019 situation with such specificity. Dr. Cortez, who had begun the investigation as a skeptic, found herself writing papers on medically documented spontaneous remission of multiple reproductive pathologies coinciding with reported Marian apparition, while simultaneously scheduling her own therapy to process the cognitive dissonance. Media descended, local news first, then national, then international Catholic press. The story was too strange and too well documented to dismiss. A centuries-old prophecy, a sealed chamber, impossible medical healing, and at the center of it all, an 8-year-old adopted girl who spoke with the Virgin Mary by an old well. But the most profound changes happened within the Whitman family itself. Margaret, whose heart had been closed by grief and fear, opened like a flower in unexpected sunshine. She embraced Lucia with a fierce maternal love that needed no biology to validate it. She spoke to the baby growing inside her, Cristobal, as Lucia insisted, with joy instead of terror. She even called the lawyer who had prepared the adoption reversal papers and told her to shred them, that she'd been temporarily insane to even consider such a thing. Thomas, who had spent years trying to bridge the gap between his wife and daughter, found himself the grateful witness to a healing he'd never quite believed possible. His faith, which had been largely theoretical, became something concrete and lived. And Lucia, the small girl who had lost her first mother and learned to protect herself with silence, blossomed into a child who laughed and played and trusted that this family would not abandon her. The trauma didn't disappear overnight, but it no longer defined her. She had been seen by the Mother of God, and in that seeing had learned that she was worthy of being loved. The statue of Our Lady remained in the Whitman house, placed in a small shrine that Father Sandoval helped them build in the living room. The Archbishop granted special permission for it to stay on private property, understanding that some miracles are meant to be intimate rather than institutional. And sometimes in the early morning or late evening, when the light was just right, people who visited would swear they could smell roses, though there were no roses anywhere on the property. On July 15, 2020, Margaret Whitman gave birth to a healthy baby boy weighing 7 pounds, 6 ounces. They named him Cristobal Thomas Whitman. Cristobal for the priest who had believed Singing Water's visions, Thomas for his father who had learned to believe in impossible things. The obstetrician who delivered him, Dr. Sarah Chen, stood in the delivery room with tears streaming down her face, because she had documented every week of this medically impossible pregnancy, and now held in her hands a perfect child who should not exist. Lucia, who was 9 by then, held her baby brother and whispered to him in Spanish. The lady in blue kept her promise. She always keeps her promises. You're going to do amazing things, Cristobal. You're going to heal so many children. But first, you get to just be my little brother, and I get to teach you how to be brave. And Margaret, holding both her children, the daughter given through loss and adoption, the son given through impossible healing, finally understood what the woman in blue had been trying to tell her all along. That love doesn't require perfection, that families are built not just through biology, but through choosing each other again and again, through staying when things are hard, through allowing ourselves to be seen in our brokenness and loved anyway. That miracles aren't always dramatic interventions in the laws of physics. Sometimes they're the quiet transformation of closed hearts into open ones, of fear into faith, of strangers into family. Father Sandoval performed Cristobal's baptism in a private ceremony at the Cathedral Basilica. During the service, he spoke of Singing Water, the indigenous woman whose visions had predicted this moment across 3 centuries. He spoke of Padre Cristobal de Rivera, who had died in the Pueblo Revolt, but whose faith had been vindicated by time. He spoke of the persistence of love across generations, cultures, and the apparent divisions that separate us. Our Lady of Guadalupe appeared to an indigenous peasant named Juan Diego in 1531, Father Sandoval said, his voice carrying through the cathedral. She appeared as one of his people, spoke his language, and left her image on his tilma, as proof that God's love transcends the boundaries we create. She appeared again in Santa Fe, to a Pueblo woman during a time of terrible violence, and promised that love would triumph over division. And she appeared once more, to a small adopted girl who needed a mother, and to a mother who needed to learn how to receive the daughter she'd been given. She appeared because that is what she does. She goes to the broken places and the impossible situations, and she says, I am here. You are loved. Do not be afraid. This child we baptize today is living proof that miracles aren't relics of the past. They're happening now, in our time, in our city, in the lives of ordinary people who dare to believe that love is stronger than impossibility. After the baptism, as people gathered in the parish hall for the celebration, an elderly Pueblo woman approached Margaret. She introduced herself as Teresa Trujillo and said her grandmother had been named Singing Water. My grandmother told stories, Teresa said, about a vision she had as a young woman, before the Spanish killed her and so many of our people. She said the mother of all would return to the sacred spring, that she would use a child to heal a wounded mother, and that from that healing would come a child who would heal many. We thought it was just a story, but my cousin sent me the news articles about your family, and I had to come see. She looked at baby Cristobal sleeping in Margaret's arms. My grandmother said when this child came, it would mean the mother of all had forgiven the violence between our peoples. That Spanish and indigenous, Anglo and Mexican, all the divisions we've created, they don't matter to her. She loves all of us. She chooses all of us. And she's patient enough to wait 300 years to prove it. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. Would you like to hold him? Your grandmother's vision made him possible. Teresa took the baby with the gentle confidence of someone who had held many children. She spoke to him in Tiwa, Words Margaret didn't understand but felt in her bones were blessings. Then she handed him back and placed something in Margaret's hand. A small turquoise bead, worn smooth with age. This belonged to my grandmother. She wore it the day she had her vision. I want your son to have it, so he remembers that his life is the answer to a prayer spoken in a language most people have forgotten, by a woman most people never knew existed, but whose faith was strong enough to reach across centuries. That night, back in their house on Canyon Road, the Whitman family gathered around the shrine where the terracotta statue stood. Thomas held Cristobal, Margaret held Lucia, and together they prayed, not with formal words, but with grateful hearts that had learned that miracles were real, that love was stronger than impossibility, and that sometimes the Mother of God uses the most broken situations to reveal the most extraordinary grace. Outside, the well stood silent under the stars, its stones still holding the memories of 3 centuries of prayers. The chamber below remained empty now, its artifacts carefully documented and its secrets revealed. But those who passed by late at night, walking down Canyon Road, sometimes reported seeing a faint blue light emanating from the well and smelling roses where no roses grew. And in homes across Santa Fe, in hospitals and orphanages, in places where people struggled with infertility or grieved lost children or feared they could never be the parents they wanted to be, the story of the Whitman family spread like hope taking root in rocky soil, because the message of Our Lady of Guadalupe, whether spoken in 1531 to Juan Diego or in 1680 to Singing Water, or in 2019 to Lucia Navarro Whitman, has always been the same. You are seen. You are loved. Do not be afraid. And I am here, always, waiting by the well of your deepest thirst, ready to transform your impossibility into miracle. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to know that miracles still happen, that broken families can be healed, and that Our Lady never stops watching over those who cry out to her. Subscribe to receive daily stories of miracles and hope, and join a community of believers who know that faith is stronger than fear, and love is the greatest miracle of all. Because in a world that often feels dark and divided, we need to remember, the Mother of all is still appearing, still healing, still transforming the impossible into the extraordinary, one family, one well, one opened heart at a time.